We're ready to go, I believe. Tonight's meeting is a single comprehensive report that's before us for the Central Kingston Growth Strategy final recommendations report, and that's the single item that we're dealing with tonight. I would like to call this meeting to order, and I'd love to have a mover and a seconder for accepting the agenda. Oh, sorry. I always forget this new process. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate that, and welcome everyone to tonight's committee meeting. Again, just wanted to go through who's with us in the meeting this evening for those who may be watching at home. Again, Mr. Chair, we do have quorum. We are currently missing Councillor Hill. I don't believe I received regrets from him, so he might be popping on here shortly. And joining us from staff this evening is Tim Park, Director of Planning Services, Sukriti Agarwal, Acting Manager Policy Planning, James Barr, Manager Development Approvals, Paige Agnew, Commissioner Community Services, Mike Slaggy, Planner, Janet James, Deputy City Clerk, Blair Johnson is our host for this evening, and I'm, of course, Elizabeth Fawcett, Committee Clerk. We don't currently have any applicants or agents, as this is going to be presented by staff. We do have 10 members of the public in the gallery this evening and an addendum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Which is my reminder that for approval of agenda, that includes the addendum that's now public and we've all received. So if there's a mover and a second. Thank you, Councillor Kiley. Councillor Hutchison. Confirmation of minutes, there are none. Disclosure of pecuniary interest, seeing none. We have no delegations, we have no briefings, although the public will have an opportunity to speak. I will read the very brief business declaration, and then we'll move right into the presentation. This portion of the meeting is open to the public. The city has initiated a new process in which members of the public will have the opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes on comprehensive reports presented before the Planning Committee. Those wishing to provide oral comments at this meeting will be invited to do so. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but that person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. So I believe Sukriti is going to be presenting and the report is attached and available online. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sukriti Agarwal, and I'm the Acting Manager of Policy Planning with Planning Services. Today, we are here to present the recommendations of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. As committee members and some residents may know, this study was initiated at the end of 2017 in response to Council's consideration of an interim control bylaw for the near campus areas. We acknowledge that this is the first time when the committee and community members are seeing detailed recommendations coming out of this work. And we are here today to seek feedback on these recommendations. I just wanted to clarify that we are not at a decision point yet on these recommendations, and we are seeking feedback on the official plan and zoning recommendations that we will be presenting today by November 5th. We will continue to refine the proposed official plan policies and zoning recommendations as part of the new zoning bylaw project, and also as part of an upcoming city-initiated official plan amendment. And I know that this has been a long project, and I want to thank all community members for participating in past engagement events, including the neighborhood walks, and for all of the feedback that we have received to date on this project. Also wanted to acknowledge all of the guidance that was provided to us by the community working group. And also we are very appreciative of their patience throughout this project as we were trying to balance this work with some of the other parallel studies. I'm happy to introduce Mike Silagi, Senior Planner, who will be taking us through the project background and a high-level summary of the recommendations today.
Thank you, Sukriti. Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I assume you can hear me all right? Good. So as Sukriti mentioned, my name is Mike Silagi. I'll be running through this evening's presentation. Some of the earlier slides will reiterate what Sukriti just summarized, so I'll try to go through them fairly quickly. Next slide, please. The purpose of this meeting is to host the non-statutory public meeting to present the general recommendations that have emerged from the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, or CKGS study. We are seeking feedback from the committee as well as members of the public on the recommendations, as they will be further refined through the new citywide zoning bylaw and future official plan amendment process. Next slide, please. The study itself was initiated at the end of 2017 in response to Council's consideration of an interim control bylaw to prohibit, to prohibit new development or alterations to residential dwellings within the districts of Sydneym, Portsmouth, and Williamsville. Council directed staff to report on recommendations to help guide appropriate infill and intensification in these areas. Based on staff recommendations, however, the study area was expanded to include all residential areas regulated by zoning bylaw 8499 for a more holistic approach. Ultimately, WSP Canada Group Limited was engaged to carry out this study. Next slide, please. Here's a map showing the study area with the areas in question in yellow. This includes 16 separate neighborhoods, all governed by the zoning bylaw 8499. The areas left out, which are the remaining colors, are those that fall under their own separate existing or in-process frameworks. That includes downtown and harbor area, Williamsville Main Street area, North Kingstown secondary plan area, and the Kingston Provincial Campus secondary plan area. Next slide, please. The intent then of this study was to identify strategic areas where the greatest intensification could occur with a policy and zoning framework in support of these intensification areas. Also to establish a policy and zoning framework to more appropriately manage development in the areas outside the intensification areas. And to prepare design guidelines for the intensification and non-intensification areas. And finally, to assess available infrastructure and services within the study area. Next slide, please. The study was carried out over 4 phases, which included first a background analysis determining the existing zoning, policy, built form, and servicing and infrastructure context. The second phase resulted in an initial identification of intensification areas, followed by recommended directions for the policies and zoning framework. These previous phases were all presented and made public under separate cover. The final phase saw the direct development of the policy and regulatory framework for the intensification and non-intensification areas. Throughout the study, a variety of public engagement activities, which was detailed in the reports, were undertaken along with workshops and meetings with community and technical working groups, which all helped to inform the recommendations presented this evening. Next slide, please. As the CKGS study was advancing, a number of other city initiatives had been undertaken or are upcoming, which the study was meant to work in concert with, both integrating lessons learned and to ensure that recommendations from this work does not contradict the new directions taken by the city. Those other past initiatives include phase 1 of the Density by Design project, which focused on a detailed analysis of the Williamsville Main Street corridor and evaluated how best to integrate more intense forms of development along both the roadway and with the lower intensity areas bordering the corridor. Another study was the Life Cycle Fiscal Impacts of Development study, which evaluated the fiscal efficacy of various forms of development across the city and concluded that more urban, tight-knit, multi-unit built forms were the most efficient and consumed the least amount of resources. This study continued to show that in a city intent on addressing climate change, promoting more of this form of development within central neighborhoods was the responsible choice. More recently, there was bedrooms limits and amendments to secondary residential units regulations bylaw, which was endorsed by council and addressed a concern heard consistently leading up to and throughout the project. That existing regulations were permitting unintended internal expansion and intensification, particularly as it related to detached secondary units, which were having negative impacts on neighboring properties, and the general servicing and functionality of the impacted areas. This bylaw was subsequently appealed and is waiting a hearing date, but the clear direction and intent was established through council's approval. Finally, recognizing that within the next 2 years, the city would be required to undertake a full review of the official plan in accordance with the Planning Act. This will provide the city an opportunity to fully integrate the lessons learned from these initiatives into the new policy directions and strengthen the vision for development across the city. As a result, some of the recommendations that have implications beyond the scope of the study will be reserved for further review, such as the policies for non-intensification areas and the design guidelines, which may apply citywide. Next slide, please. In developing the final recommendations of the study, it was key to establish definitions of success to evaluate the recommendations and to maintain their focus. Those 4 definitions of success are: 1, to have respect for the existing neighborhood character in balance with other city objectives, such as leadership on climate action, strategic growth and intensification, housing affordability, and social equity. 2, to have respect for and to reflect the new needs and aspirations of the city, the intent of the official plan, and council direction. 3, to develop an approach that is clear and understandable and is easy to implement by avoiding unnecessary complexity. And finally, to develop an approach that allows many or most individual intensification projects to be viable under reasonable assumptions, with enough projects greenlit to address strategic smart growth goals. Next slide, please. In determining the intensification areas, several criteria were established to assist with the selection. Those criteria being the need for frontage along major corridors on the edges of neighborhoods where impacts can be reduced, the presence of existing multi-unit higher density developments, access to transit and active transportation networks to encourage their use, proximity of amenities, services, and institutional uses to ensure a supportive lifestyle for new residents, infrastructure considerations, which the availability of servicing, required upgrades, and the potential for upgrades, and finally, community feedback from members of the public and the community working groups, which help to determine and shape the intensification areas and the build form recommended within. From that, the 3 areas were selected. Number 1, the Brock and Johnson Street corridor west of Division, Portsmouth Avenue, which is composed of 2 sub areas along the avenue, one at the intersection of Johnson Street and Portsmouth Avenue, and the second south along Portsmouth between the KFLNA Health Unit property and King Street West across from St. Lawrence College. Finally, the intersection of Bath Road and Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard was selected. Next slide, please. The next few slides will present the conceptual examples envisioned for the intensification areas, starting with Bronk and Johnson Street corridor shown in orange. Next slide, please. The recommendations for this area call for a multi-unit building up to the lesser of 6 stories or 20 meters, with a minimum street wall of 4 stories or 12 meters. Above the 4th story, a 2-meter step back would be included along the face of Johnson or Brock Street, where the recommendations generally see the buildings as residential with the opportunity for neighborhood at grade. Next slide, please. This slide showing the interaction with adjacent properties, with buildings having to be set back a minimum of 10 meters from the rear lot line for ample separation from neighboring properties. Within that 10-meter setback, a minimum 2-meter landscape buffer would be required. Next slide, please. And here's this view looking west along Johnson, highlighting the 4-story street wall. Next slide, please. Moving west to Portsmouth Avenue corridor, again, this area is separated into 2 areas. First, at the intersection with Johnson Street. Next slide, please. This area recommendations calls for a 4-story or 12 meters, whichever is lesser, walk-up apartment or stacked townhouse type development. Next slide, please. Again, employing the 10-meter rear yard setback, including the 2-meter landscape buffer. Next slide, please. Moving to the second area across from St. Lawrence College, this area was recommended to be developed with 2 separate forms, owing to the unique lot fabric for the area between Calderwood Drive and north of Mary Street. Next slide, please. First, looking at the area south of Mary Street toward King, the vision is again for a 4-story or 12-meter walk-up apartment or townhouse type development, similar to the previous area. Next slide, please. And also employing the 10-meter minimum rear yard setback, including the 2-meter landscape buffer. Next slide, please. Moving north, owing to the unique lotting for this portion of Portsmouth Avenue, with a high number of through lots, a different form of development was considered. The recommended zoning looks to have development here address both Portsmouth and Woodstone Crescent, with stacked or back-to-back townhouses or townhouses with internal parking areas, again to a maximum of the lesser of 4 stories or 12 meters. Next slide, please. Finally, for the Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard and Bath Road area, this area was considered the most appropriate for larger scale intensification. Next slide, please. For the site, multi-unit residential buildings of up to the lesser of 12 stories or 38 meters are recommended. This would include a podium of 6 stories or 20 meters, followed by an additional 6 stories, upwards of 18 meters high above the podium. The upper stories are to be set back 3 meters for Sir John A. Boulevard and Bath Road, and carrying over from the work done within the Williamsville corridor. The tower portions would be limited to a floor plate of no more than 790 square meters, and any adjacent towers would be would include a separation distance of a minimum of 25 meters. Next slide, please. The recommendations further include addressing the frontage along Wright Crescent, where similar to Johnson and Brock, development to a maximum of the lesser of 6 stories or 20 meters with a minimum street wall of 12 meters, including a 2-meter step back above the 4th story is envisioned. Next slide, please. That step back, along with the intervening street, are intended to help transition from the 12-story buildings to the existing low-rise townhomes along Wright Crescent. Next slide, please. Throughout the intensification zones, several transition techniques are employed, including building separation through required rear and side setbacks, the use of a step back above the 4th stories to help frame roadways and to maintain a more pedestrian scale, a combination of minimum rear yard setbacks and a landscape buffer to provide both separation distance with visual screening for aesthetic improvements. And finally, employing intervening streets as an additional form of separation between buildings. Next slide, please. In support of the proposed intensification areas, a new policy section 10G is proposed to be added to the official plan. These policies will address matters such as height, built form, transition, location of parking, and a general holding symbol related to servicing and more detailed transportation analysis. Next slide, please. Regarding the non-intensification areas, several changes have been recommended to both simplify and to establish a clearer intention for built form within these areas. Within the low density areas, recommended changes include removal of the FSI and lot coverage provisions, as these performance standards were deemed to not be appropriate given the wide variety of lot sizes in the study area. Instead, a maximum building depth of 18 meters as measured from the minimum front yard setback is now proposed. This maximum depth is predicated on the ability to provide a minimum separation of 7.5 meters between the rear building wall and the rear lot line. Front yard setbacks in some areas, namely the existing A zone and Kingsport areas, are to be set at 4.5 meters with some flexibility to vary depending on existing context. Height is also now to be described in both meters and stories. And lastly, minimum lot frontages are to be included. Next slide, please. This slide shows the intent of the new maximum building depth provision, which again, being in 18 meters as measured from the minimum front yard setback with an assumed 7.5 meter distance to the rear lot line. As mentioned, in some areas, that front setback will be set at 4.5 meters with the flexibility to reduce based on existing context, where if one or both of the adjacent buildings are located closer than 4.5 meters to the front lot line, an average will be used. That maximum building depth, which will be maintained at 18 meters, will shift forward accordingly. This maximum depth is effectively recommended to replace the rear yard setback, which was often set at a minimum of 7.5 meters. However, as mentioned, given the wide variety of lot sizes in the study area, resulting development would often be much larger than anticipated, but still maintain the intent of the zoning based on FSI, lot coverage, and rear yard setback requirements. In addition, currently, building depth is often measured as an average of adjacent buildings, where the issue has the potential to be exacerbated through the community. This often resulted in negative impacts as they relate to section 2.7 of the official plan, which speaks to impacts on neighboring properties with matters such as shadowing and overlook. This new recommendation is intended to clarify the intent, to simplify the implementation and clarify the intent of these zones consistent with section 2.7 and to resolve these unexpected consequences in providing a more standardized development envelope, which still offers some flexibility for design and architectural expression. Next slide, please. Within the low density zones, several zoning changes are recommended, including the creation of separate zones for both the Old Sydneym Heritage Conservation District, as well as the Portsmouth Village Heritage Character Area. The Kingsport area will also include a new zone, all of which are reflective of the character of those areas. A small number of residential properties that are designated residential in the official plan, but zoned for special education and medical uses, or E zone, are going to be rezoned or proposed to be rezoned to urban residential 5, which is proposed to replace the existing A zone. And a small number of properties located at the intersection of Frontenac and Jenkins Streets are to be rezoned from multiple family dwelling B3 zone to urban residential 5 zone, which is a more appropriate reflection of the existing build form of the area. Next slide, please. Within the existing medium to high density areas, the recommended zoning changes are for the 3 to 6 family dwelling B zone, the inclusion of a minimum lot frontage, the addition of the maximum building depth up to 18 meters as measured from the minimum front yard setback, again with the caveat of a minimum 7.5 meter rear yard setback, and a front yard setback set at 4.5 meters with the opportunity for reductions based on existing context. For the multiple family dwelling B1 zone, density requirements are recommended to be removed and replaced with minimum lot area requirements. Finally, the minimum unit sizes the minimum unit sizes in multifamily zones are recommended to be removed as they are dealt with in the building code. Next slide, please. One zoning change has been recommended for the medium to high density zones, which is for the properties located in the multiple family dwelling B3 zone west of Division Street in the Chatham-Colborne Street area north of William Street, where they are proposed to be placed in their own zone to reflect the character of their area. Next slide, please. Finally, as part of this study, urban design guidelines were developed in order to assist new development in being generally more compatible with their existing context and to balance this compatibility with the various public interest goals of the city. These guidelines address development within the various sub areas of the study, the proposed intensification areas, as well as providing for general development guidelines. They speak to matters such as transition, materiality, the public and private realms, parking, and servicing. These guidelines will be further reviewed as we evaluate whether they can be integrated as official plan policies and how they integrate with other existing guidelines. Again, this will be done with the official plan review that is slated for 2023. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, as Sukriti noted earlier, we will continue to seek feedback on the recommendations presented tonight, with comments being received until November 5th. Any comments received within that time will be assessed and brought in through future planning processes. Beyond that, the zoning recommendations, which have already been integrated with the second draft of the new city-wide zoning bylaw, was released on August 6th and is now also available for comment. And finally, the policy recommendations to add a new section 10G related to the proposed intensification areas will be brought forward through an official plan amendment this coming fall, where a statutory public meeting will be held offering further opportunity for public comment. Thank you, and staff are available for questions and comments.
There I go, muted again. Thank you very much. Now will be an opportunity for the committee to ask questions, and then we'll open it up to the public at that time. So who among committee members would like to make comments at all on this? Yes, I think I see Councillor Hutchison's hand wandering up. The floor is yours.
Sometimes my unmute button works, sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, I'm sure there'll be other questions in committees. Often somebody touches something off and then people start running with it. So first of all, let me say there's a lot of good things in this. And I like some of the limitations that have been put on, and I recognize it's up to planning committee and council to support this if there's good ideas of when time comes. The one thing I've noticed, this came from the public and it concerns me as well, and that is the allowance on Brock Street around Victoria Park for 6-story buildings. And I think over time that will tend to be what exactly does happen if we allow it. And to me, it subtracts from the older, almost Victorian aesthetic that is supplied by that square. And there are other squares in the city. McBurney Park's one, for example, but not in the study area. The Heritage Park at Napier and Mac, which I think is. So to me, from that point of view, I think this around the square should be maintained as low-rise, single-family or zoning. On the rest of it, once you're off of the square, then I think it would be fine, or at least can be entertained, depending on what other people have to say. So is that a possibility? And what did specifically, what did staff look at with regard to Victoria Park? That's my question.
Thank you. Who would like to address those questions?
I could just speak to initially that the corridors were looked at as a whole, and again highlighting the criteria that were used to identify the general areas or the intensification areas, and then the heights were established based on primarily the right of way for those, for in this case Johnson and Brock Street, which is 20 meters. So that was used as the primary kind of center for the ultimate height. I can't say we looked exactly like specifically at the park. However, there are no existing heritage properties around the park, and the park is not yet designated. So if that comes to be, there will be considerations that will have to be taken into account, often related to materiality. But in terms of trying to achieve the goals of directing intensification to the appropriate areas, that this corridor was one of the areas that stood out high above the rest. I believe Sukriti has something else to add.
Sukriti, yeah.
Thank you. And I see Ms. Agarwal was waving at me, so the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add with respect to Victoria Park, we were also looking at intensification opportunities close to amenity areas, and Victoria Park being a really excellent park space. And that's why one of the reasons was that we chose properties fronting on Victoria Park, on Broad Street across from Victoria Park as a potential intensification area.
Right. So I guess that's something I think is an oversight and should be corrected. And I'll wait to hear from the councillor for the area, for the district. But I got a feeling that's the direction he and I would like to go. So I mentioned this Victoria aesthetic, but the main option is also the sense of open space and not being enclosed within blocks of 6-story buildings or any kind of higher buildings immediately to the park. I realize what staff is trying to do. They're trying to accommodate growth here, trying to make it workable. And I understand that. So I'm thinking this is an adjustment for that purpose that could work. So another question, when you decided that Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard on Bath, Area 3, and you cited on 12 stories. So to me, this is one thing that we could run into once it starts to happen, particularly, maybe before. And so did staff look, and I think maybe they did, at the potential of shadowing from those buildings onto the lower density housing that is to the east? And affects, I doubt it affects that much the houses to the west, but you know, whatever you've got to say about that. That's my question.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we did look at, I'd say it's a fairly basic, it's called a Sunshadow Study, based on the analysis that we had put together, all those conceptual buildings that we presented this evening. There is some shadowing, but when we looked at it, the shadowing is rather limited, except for on the worst part of the winter in December. And in fact, I have, if we'd like to pull up the slides there, I've included them in the presentation. Yes, starting here. So I guess just if you can just scroll through the slides evenly, we see like there is some shadowing at 10 a.m. but very limited, and by 2 p.m. it is long past that. So next slide, please. June, the height of summer is really very little concern. By 8 a.m. it's not hitting the school property or near the school property. 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. still passing through the adjacent library and neighboring properties. And again, by 6 p.m., you're already seeing that it's basically past the properties. Next slide, please. September, again, the shadows are longer, but only limited reach onto the neighboring properties. Again, at 4 p.m., we're starting to get to the shorter days here. So there is some, but not, I wouldn't say an excessive amount. And then next slide, please. And this is where it would be the most severe. Obviously 8 a.m. is still fairly dark, so those shadows could be ignored for a moment. 10 a.m. there is some shadowing on the library property. And then by 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. there is some shadowing on those Right Crescent properties. Again, this is very conceptual. So when if in the future development application is submitted, they will have to include their own Sunshadow Study to show exactly how those impacts would, or how those shadows would impact the properties. But even on a basic conceptual model, we felt that the shadowing was fairly limited. And just depending on how this comes together in the future, we'll have to analyze that further.
Right. Fair. I understand what you're saying. And thank you for that. I'm not going to be living there, so I'm on tenterhooks about this, and it's not my district. But of course, whoever the developer is will have to present the shadowing study and maybe peer reviewed and so on. I'm wondering if I'm just wondering if that's adequate. Some of these shadowing studies, when we actually get done, are more severe than is first looked at. So I wanted to raise that. And I have another question. Last time we saw, well, the verbal presentation we got, which was a bit of an onslaught, I would say. I raised the issue of egress or an ingress from onto Sir John A. Macdonald. Afterwards, I thought, well, that was foolish. But then I've rethought it again, and I actually think it's not. If people are willing to go one way when they leave, when they go in and out of the building or buildings. And the reason I say that is because it would release or alleviate traffic concerns on the internal part, like to the east of Sir John A. Macdonald. And I was wondering if staff looked at that at all, or how they would evaluate that.
I think that detailed level of analysis, we did not get into that level of analysis. However, just generally speaking, our assumption is that traffic would, or as I say, ingress and egress would not be along Sir John A, given the level of traffic and the speeds of traffic in the area. I suppose if a development application was submitted and they proposed that with a traffic study in hand, we would have to evaluate that. But in terms of this study, we did not look at that level of detail.
Thank you. And I see Ms. Agnew has her hand up as well.
Yes. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So certainly, just to reinforce what Mr. Szilagyi is saying, as part of this, there was transportation analysis that was done by WSP in support of the secondary plan, but was also thoroughly reviewed by our transportation services group. So, you know, in terms of the intensification locations, they're supportive of them generally, and think it works with respect to where we have, you know, express transit, good walkability, where we have expanded active transportation opportunities that will continue to unfold with time. But to Mike's point, getting into a lot by lot analysis, a lot of it will be subject to looking at any individual development application should council want to support intensification at this location, and then figuring out, what would make sense from a variety of points of view, whether it's the access control and the closeness to the intersection, what that would do with respect to transportation on Sir John and Macdonald, but also on Bath. So some of that information is still to come, but they have certainly been an engaged partner with us at the table in evaluating the intensification opportunities that are being presented tonight.
Okay. I'm not sure when the commissioner was being highly diplomatic or not. I was just wondering if the idea would had any merit at all. Like if you say, no, we're not going to do that because it's simply unsafe, and I would just say, okay. But I'm just thinking that because of the force of traffic and population and the effect on a low density area that's immediately adjoining those buildings, there's 4 of them. They probably will outnumber by a fair bit the whole population that's there. So I'm just thinking ahead, and if that could be considered, I guess that's the best I can do. My last question for now, I'm concerned about through lots, and I thought that was really interesting that along Calderwood in Portsmouth, you're suggesting small apartment buildings, but I think it was more stacked townhousing. And I thought that's good. And I'm concerned about those through lots because there is a lot of big lots in there, which are, in my observation, not utilized. And when we're having housing issues, I don't want to ruin somebody's sense of their lifestyle, but eventually I think we should be encouraging the use of that land. And if it can do with a through lot, it seems useful. So my question is, we have an 18-meter limit with I think it's 7.5 meter setback. And so I guess that's for small apartment buildings. And is it possible on those through lots to put something at I don't know, it might be the east side, doesn't matter, on the back side of facing the other street? Is there still room to do that in some cases? And will this policy encourage that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so for that area, the zoning actually recommends, it basically treats both frontages as the front lot line, in that there wasn't the minimum required rear yard setback. It was simply 3 meters from Calderwood and 3 meters from Portsmouth, with the intention that that would encourage that type of development that would treat both frontages as the front facade and having either centralized parking or, if it's a large enough development, some sort of underground structure or structured parking of some sort. So it was looked at, and that's the hope for that. There's a lot of opportunity there, we feel, and a lot of different configurations, which is why we didn't look to model it. We just put up some photos as examples. But yes, the zoning was specifically tailored for that portion of Portsmouth Avenue to address both frontages.
Okay, I have one final question about that. That is on Portsmouth, I can see small apartment buildings basically facing St. Lawrence College and probably for student use and so on, though we're not allowed to say that. Is it possible, but the adjoining, and I know something about the adjoining neighborhood, the low density neighborhood to the east, and is it possible to sort of split zone that so that it would be townhouses on the resident side and apartment buildings, or whatever the builder wants to do relative to the zoning, on the Portsmouth side? Because I'm thinking townhouses, stacked townhouses would be more amenable to the neighbors.
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, for that area, again, the opportunities was trying to look at the built form when looking at the uses, whether it be a small walk-up apartment building or townhouses. That was considered. maybe I'm not clear exactly which area you're speaking about, but given the size of the lots, the split zoning wasn't necessarily, it just made it a little too complicated. Whereas when we looked at it and trying to, again, with one of our intentions to keep things as clear and simple to allow for these developments to occur without having to throw in too many complications in the process.
Okay, I was just thinking of encouragement to severance. And although that can be a pain in the neck, I reckon. But anyway, I'll leave that concept with you because I'm trying to look ahead and see where the problems might arise with the populations that are in two different places, even though they're in the same neighborhood. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from the committee? Yes, Councillor Sanik and then Councillor Kiley, and then I'll probably weigh in with one or two. Councillor Sanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, just a question to staff. Like, I know that we've done public meetings and we've done workshops and whatnot, but for these areas, these specific areas that we're recommending to become, like high density, for example, like Johnson and Portsmouth, like what notices have gone to the people that are living on Johnson on either side, next to Portsmouth, for example? Like, I'm looking at the number of attendees and there's only 14 attendees. And I'm just wondering, like, we're making big decisions tonight. And if the people on the south side of Johnson, if they're really aware that, if a developer was to buy the homes on the north side of Johnson, west of Portsmouth, that could all become, apartments. And I'm sure they would want to weigh in their opinion. We also don't have the district councillor here tonight, I don't think, or for some of these areas, like for this area, we don't, just looking at the attendees, or for Sydneym district. So that's another concern I have. And so I'm just like, we're going to be making decisions. And then if there is an application 4 years time, next year, 6 months time, all these people might go, when did this happen? And that will be bad. And so I just wondered, like, how did we, like, promote this central growth study to the people in these areas, other than the newspaper?
Thank you, and I recognize Ms. Egg.
Thank you, and through you. And just to clarify, I know that we provided some introductory comments, but there are no decisions that are being made as part of this meeting. Tonight is really about information sharing relative to the development of detailed policy. So it's really about kicking off the conversation, and we are going to be accepting comments for the next 2.5 months until November 5th. So if people are unable to attend tonight, they always have the opportunity of watching the meeting and the presentation, writing to us, reaching out for a meeting. So tonight is really, yes, we recognize that there's not as many people here maybe as we would like, because we always want as much participation as possible. But this is just the introduction of the detailed policy so that we can have the conversation initially with this committee and to start it off with the community, so that we have an opportunity to hear more, and council won't be faced with actually making decisions related to this policy for some of it 6 months from now. So there's a lot of time to go for people to be able to reach out, and also to be able to take the time to read the information. And we will be reaching out to other stakeholders through the process. But we did want to get the ideas out there as quickly as possible, because this process has been in development for some time, and recognizing how important it is and how big the study area is, because it does cover multiple areas and multiple neighborhoods across the city. We wanted to get the information out there to start the conversation. So no decisions tonight at all. What we've been asking for is just to acknowledge that the committee is receiving the information for the purposes really so that we can conclude our contract with WSP, and then the work going forward in terms of any changes or integration of public feedback, we will be doing that at the staff level, absent of any further participation from the actual consultant that we've been working with.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
Well, it says the policy recommendations be approved. So that's what scares me. So the policy recommendations are the of allowing like so much height, like how point to Councillor Hutchinson, right? That we're going to allow 6 stories across from Victoria Park. Is that part of the policy?
And just to clarify, that's a great point that you brought up. I believe it's reflected on the addendum. That's for the committee. What we have asked is for an actual amendment to the recommendation that is associating with this report to change the word approved. That was what was inserted in there. That was actually a clerical error. So we're not approving anything tonight. The new recommendation is reflected in the addendum that was circulated to the committee, just for that clarification.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Could I request of our clerk that the addendum be available to put on the screen, because I'm not sure all of the public will have access, immediate access to that. That would be helpful. So, Councillor Rosanna, any further questions?
So it's to be received, and I see the change. Okay, so I do have concerns, like for some of the areas that are proposed. I have concerns about the tree loss if they were to be converted from single family homes like they are now to then high rises. Obviously, that means clear cutting the lot. So right in some areas that where tree loss will be affected. So Alfred, like Albert Street and Johnson to the north, it looks like there's very large houses or very large trees there. And, so I just have concerns about the effects of the tree canopy on this, and also for what's being proposed for between Bath Road and Right Crescent. Is that over top of the existing YMCA? It looks like it's on top of where Onguanada is right now. Is that also over top of where the YMCA is?
Through you, Mr. Chair. First, with the trees, we hear that concern, and it is something that we tried to take into account in the sense of providing some ample setbacks along Johnson and Brock corridor up to 2 meters, as well as the 2 meter landscape buffer at the rear, and a minimum landscaped area, landscaped open space of 10% of these developments would require lot consolidation, just based on the required minimum lots to allow these kinds of development. So again, not knowing the exact details of future developments, that is something we try to account for to leave enough space to either preserve or to plant new trees. And as for the area around Bath Road, yes, those sites were identified as the intensification zones. However, we are in, well, 2 things. One, the areas are currently zoned for taller developments. They're in the B zone, and the B's forgetting the exact zone, but they are zoned for taller developments already. And as well, we're looking at the outlook over the next 20 to 25 years as it will relate to eventually with the infrastructure studies. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to happen in the next 2 years or something like that. So the YMCA would have the opportunity to sell the property or redevelop if they wanted themselves. But these were the lots that were identified as having the greatest potential to absorb the intensification based on all those criteria we set up before, and just looking forward into the future.
Okay, thank you. And I also just wanted to say I do agree with the point raised by Councillor Hutchinson, concern about having tall buildings right across from Victoria Park, across from High Park in Toronto. I don't know how it looks exactly right now, but I do know there's a lot of like 3 or 4 level mid-rise buildings across from High Park. Again, I haven't been there this year, so who knows what's come up during COVID, but no sky, like no high rises, they're mid-rises, and 6 stories, that's pretty high for Kingston in that area. So I don't think I could support that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So Kylie was next.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, thanks for your presentation, and thanks to staff on the note of public engagement for including the letters that community members sent in. I think it was Appendix A, where we saw very transparently what people have said and how that went into this report. That's really helpful for folks. So thanks for doing that. I'm wondering about our climate goals as a city. I know that at the beginning of the presentation, density by design was mentioned as one of the kind of 4 big reports that helped influence some of these recommendations. Perhaps we could get a bit more comment on how this proposal is climate friendly or would help us meet our carbon reduction goals.
I don't know if my colleagues want to.
I see everybody's hand came up. So I'll recognize Paige, then I'll recognize Sukriti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly happy to both tackle this question with myself and Ms. Agarwal. So on the climate change front and looking at the learning that we undertook with density by design, where you see the continuity of thinking, again, is in certain areas around sensitivity. And certainly this was a prevalent thought and integrated into the policy that council approved for Williamsville, was really maintaining that 4 to 6 story, that mid-rise scale for Kingston, and then looking at the strategic insertion of areas that could receive greater height and density, subject to looking at our compatibility criteria and evaluating where those locations are, and they're reflected in particularly the intersection at Bath and Sir John A. Macdonald, where you see the greatest height permissions that we have suggested as an initial draft policy. We've also looked at, again, on the climate change front, looking at allocating the density to the arterial roads, and that's where the Brock and Johnson comes in, looking at the corner of Portsmouth and King and how we round down there to Portsmouth and Johnson. Again, those are arterial roads that have the best transit service and greatest walkability. So from a climate change perspective, the better we can do in terms of strategic location of our growth and density to those areas helps to reinforce all of our climate change goals, gives the ability to even have greater ridership or greater multimodal living. So that was a key consideration. Also, again, looking at really trying to maintain that 4 to 6 story scale with respect to 2 of the intensification, or 3, I guess, technically, areas that we're looking at, that gives us the ability, again, also to support more wood frame construction, which we've had multiple conversations with council on in different capacities, certainly through Williamsville, with the ability to look at that positive impact from a carbon perspective. I don't know if Ms. Agarwal has anything additional to add, but we've been trying to incorporate all of that thinking and that learning, the strategic locations, while keeping in mind compatibility, and then looking at what that does with respect to increased opportunities for multimodal living, increased ridership beyond what we have now, and really thinking about the ability to have greater expressions of wood frame construction as a potential contribution to carbon reduction overall and greater ability, which is, a separate issue in itself, but certainly something that was a key consideration.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Yeah, a few, and that's music to my ears. I really think that's a strong justification, and maybe anticipated those responses, but hearing it like that just makes this make even more sense to me. And I'm very encouraged by that. I do have a technical question, and my apologies to staff. Truth be told, I didn't get to the report until today, so I didn't have a chance to send it ahead. But it's on this idea of proportionality. It's page 38 in our package, page 16 in the report. I'm wondering, is this proportionality analysis the same as massing, just for us non-experts? Is that essentially what we're talking about?
Who would like to tackle that?
And maybe while staff reference that page that I mentioned, I'll give my rationale for my question. I'm wondering if sometimes we get caught up on height. In my mind, at least, sometimes it's actually the massing or the scale of the building, not actually the vertical uplift, that makes a building feel large. So I don't know if that's what the proportionality is.
I could just speak quickly. For some reason, my document is, I'm trying to get to that section, but so I will maybe follow up a little later. But in terms of proportionality or just height in general, that is something we tried to consider, again, was keeping it to that pedestrian scale, where normally 4 stories is something that is viewed as more of the pedestrian oriented development. And we had considered using additional step backs to further enhance that. But then when trying to, for example, initial views were to look at the Johnson and Portsmouth corridor with those 4-story buildings and having a step back. But when we looked at it and then balanced it against our other goals of, again, trying to make this as feasible as possible, and then understanding that with wood frame construction, those step backs can be quite costly, we viewed it as just not really adding much in terms of, not a lot of gain, but the potential to lose a lot in that area. So no, the height questions, and further to that, as I mentioned earlier, with Johnson and Brock Street being a 20-meter wide right of way, we use that as the proportions to maintain, to establish that height, while also maintaining that pedestrian oriented feel along Johnson and Brock.
Thank you. And I see Ms. Agarwal would like to weigh in. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Kiley, specifically as it relates to that proportionality analysis on page 16 of WSP's report. So that was specifically referring to regulations that rely on the lot area. So for example, when we say lot coverage, which is 30% of the lot area, so they were kind of looking at how these types of regulations allow for proportionally sized buildings based on the lot area, based on the area of a lot. So these would include things such as lot coverage, floor space index, which is again measured based off of lot area, and also landscape open space. I know their image doesn't show it, but their intent was basically to show how these regulations work in conjunction with the lot area that is present.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And again, my apologies for not getting that to you in advance. Then another thing that piqued my attention just as we're going through the slides is how the buildings were presented. And this is maybe something that we can't do anything about, but when we look down on the proposed scaling of those buildings, kind of from an angle that the pedestrian wouldn't see, sometimes even that presentation makes buildings seem bigger than they would appear to a person walking. And that's usually my kind of rule of thumb metric, that like, how would a walker experience these buildings? And sometimes the view that we take from planning committee quite literally in these schematics make it seem bigger. And it's perhaps something to consider going forward when it's presented to the public. But it's a great report, and I love the intensification angle, especially vis-a-vis climate change. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from anybody who hasn't weighed in yet? Oh, I see Paige's hand is up. Go ahead, Paige.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add a little bit of additional information to what my colleague already provided. So on the proportionality front, I think, that was also trying to speak to some of the root of the issues that we've been hearing through individual development applications, where in certain areas that you have very generous size lots, when you have a lot that's 150 by 200, which is not actually uncommon, especially in Sydneym ward. When you look at a floor space index of 1, what that does is it generates something that's like fairly large, and then you can have that on each additional floor to the maximum height. And I think what some of the challenge that we've received in looking at the current zoning that we have is the extent of generosity that the existing zoning provides, especially on large lots. And I think in terms of what we've seen come forward as development applications, the use of those parameters for zoning control have created outcomes that we've certainly heard from the community feel like they're very large buildings that are being inserted in areas that maybe don't make sense. So that was sort of the thought behind changing some of those zoning parameters from what's in the existing zoning and looking at regulating, again, with that the new concept that we've come up with respect to the maximum lot depth in particular, and looking at that as opposed to continuing with more of that like proportionality approach to zoning going forward in some of these areas that we want to remain as they are and not really subject to significant intensification.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. And would you care to take the chair?
I will, and I recognize you.
Thank you. I just have a couple of quick follow-ups, if you will. I know that Councillor Osanek brought up the issue of consultation. And I'm just curious, I received a couple of emails today, which I forwarded to planners concerning a perception out there that this has been some kind of a rush and suddenly it's upon us. This is probably a question for Ms. Agarwal, who has been on top of this for some time now. Can you let us know what kinds of public consultation, what kinds of outreach, open houses, any of those kinds of things we've done, and what's been the duration of this kind of evolving study?
Ms. Agarwal?
Sorry, I was just looking for the mute button. Yes, for sure. And thank you for that question. So we have had several public engagement events as part of this work. So this was initiated in late 2017, early 2018, and we had at that time kicked it off with a public open house. And we've been using the Get Involved platform as well to receive feedback. And at the conception initiation of the project, we also had a public survey, basically like seeking feedback around what does the community really value within their neighborhood. So we launched the project with an open house in that survey. We did neighborhood walks in the summer of 2018. So those were organized with staff from planning and with the consulting team, where we invited members of the community to walk these areas with us and again identify the character of these areas. We held an urban design workshop in 2018 as well. 2 additional public workshops were held in 2019 to get feedback on potential locations for intensification. We had a virtual open house last year, as we could not have in-person engagement because of the pandemic. And as part of that, a video was released with some high-level recommendations around areas for intensification and also general recommendations and directions around the zoning and official plan policies. And then also we've had 5 meetings with the community working group members, 4 of which were led by the consulting team, and staff led the most recent one held in July of this year. And in addition to this, like I mentioned, we've been using the Get Involved platform, news releases. Early on in the project, we used Quebec signs as well, just to make sure community members were aware and were involved. So yeah, and I just wanted to emphasize the change in wording in the recommendation today, because I know that that could have also triggered some of those comments that we saw today, that it's not, we are not really at a decision point yet. We will be undertaking amendments as part of Planning Act processes, and there will continue to be future opportunities to provide additional feedback on these recommendations.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And my final question is actually a follow-up to Councillor Hutchison. And that was a question regarding heritage. Victoria Park may not be designated. I think that's an oversight on the part of the city. And that park is totally in my district. But it's also recognized by Sydneym residents as well as their neighborhood park. And the reality is that that is a heritage park. And what we have is a proposal that's going through heritage districts, and I'm glad that that was acknowledged in this report. But I think the majority of Kingstonians are stone huggers, and if you don't take into account the heritage aspects as we're planning development and density, I think it's going to put at risk the success of this project. So please, it may not be a heritage park, treat it as a heritage park as you go through the planning process. So thank you.
Would you like the chair back?
I would indeed.
You can.
Thank you. We can go to the public now. And Elizabeth, are you able to put up the addendum so that we can see the new and improved wording of the recommendation? Thank you. Thank you. And that addresses a couple of those letters I received, because as Commissioner Agnew pointed out, this is not a final recommendation by any stretch of the imagination. We're receiving this in order to encourage more input from the community. So I appreciate that. So I will turn controls over to Elizabeth, who's going to organize the public portion. How many people have their hands up? We will probably do as we usually do, which is go through 4 or 5, and then give our planners an opportunity to address those questions. So, and just a reminder, the public has 5 minutes to speak in delegation. You should identify yourself by name and address at the beginning of that process. So go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do see that we already have 4 hands raised. So just before we get started, a reminder to those who are joining us this evening that we do rely on the raised hand function in Zoom in order to call on you during this portion. Should you wish to speak, you will need to use the raise hand function, which can be located in the center of your screen when you move the mouse over the Zoom window. So, Mr. Chair, we're going to start with Matthew Geventer.
And just a reminder, I'll give you a 30-second heads up as we approach the 5-minute mark. So,
can they be allowed to go later? I want to hear what other people ask, if that's okay. I don't mind going first, but I find I fumble, and I think I'll fumble less if I give other people a chance.
Okay, Elizabeth, can you go to Mr. Geventer fourth?
Yes, Mr. Chair. We'll turn to Tara Sharkley.
Hello, Tara. The floor is yours.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. My name is Tara Sharkey, and I live at 28 Hill Street. Tonight, I am speaking on behalf of the Sydneym District Association. The SDA appreciates the work done on the Central Kingston Growth Strategy and would like to submit the following responses. Given that this report was released less than 10 days ago, there is still much to be thoroughly reviewed. However, we submit the following initial feedback and concerns. We believe that there are items that deserve positive recognition towards strategically increasing the density in the growth strategy area and stabilizing the character and integrity of our existing mixed neighborhoods. First, we applaud the 8-bedroom limit recently passed by council and hope that it is upheld through the appeal. We feel this number reflects a reasonable intensity of inhabitation in the district and would be an important step toward helping ensure stability in our low density residential areas. However, it is notably hard to enforce after construction is complete. For example, a recent development at 42 Beverly Street, which showed 2 4-bedroom and 1 3-bedroom units during the approval process, is now currently listed through torontorentals.com as having 5-bedroom units at $4,475 a month, not including utilities or Wi-Fi. 2 new bedrooms have clearly been carved out of the living rooms of the larger units. Second, we are supportive of the transition to specified maximum dimensions for buildings rather than floor area ratio for low density residential areas, which encompasses most of the Sydneym district. Third, we support the limited intensification zones shown along Johnson and Brock Street, with the understanding that greenlighting these areas to carefully designed, stepped back 6-story construction will provide much needed housing supply while lessening development pressure on stable neighborhoods. And fifth, lastly, we support the zoning changes for Collingwood Street and Union Street. However, there are still problematic items that challenge the stability of the area, and that must be changed. In brief, number 1, we do not support the maximum 18-meter principal building depth. 2, the allowance of the 10.7-meter roofs is too high. 3, there is a suggestion in the report to put aside the urban development guidelines created as part of this exercise at the request and cost of the city. We feel they are generally helpful and should be retained as a secondary document to guide the planning process. And lastly, we have a number of concerns with regulations proposed for the new Sydneym Heritage Conservation Zone. Dawn Mitchell, another member on the board, will further speak to these items later tonight. While the city is to be commended for the steps which they have taken so far, albeit slow steps over 4 years, the SDA finds that since 2017, there has not been a decrease in exemptions, variances, or egregious examples of out-of-character development. Given that the suggested growth strategy and the new zoning bylaw changes will take time to put into place, and that the recently enacted 8-bedroom limit cannot be enforced due to developer appeal, we are asking that the City Council now enact an interim control bylaw to halt development until the new zoning bylaw goes into effect. We remind the committee and the council that in 2016 and 2017, over 100 residents from the Sydneym district reached out to the council to find an appropriate way to deal with the degradation of properties and neighborhoods. Yet, as a result of the interim control bylaw being voted down, the delay of the growth strategy final report, and the time needed to enact the new zoning bylaw, the Sydneym district has continued to see egregious examples of home enlargements without planned density relief. Without implementing a pause on development now, newly proposed regulations will only spur on more last-minute development, conversions, and appeals to hastily take advantage of the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next, Elizabeth?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Vicky Schmolka.
Hello, Ms. Schmolka, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that, caught me by surprise. I thought there were a number of people in line ahead of me. Vicky Schmolka, 702 Newmarket Lane. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Planning Committee and planning staff for your endurance, because you were here last week at this time and now you're back again. And these are very important elements to be discussing during a hot summer month. So congratulations on being here. I do think the wording of the motion asking Planning Committee to approve these changes caused a certain amount of panic among people who follow Planning Committee in the depths of summer. And I'm glad to see that now the report is going to be received and not approved. I do want to support, I think, something that Chair Neal alluded to, and perhaps others did as well, that there is a need for community meetings in neighborhoods about these changes. They are profound and important, and just having a meeting like this and saying we'll deal with it in November and all comments are welcome between now and November doesn't really give people a chance to be informed. And I think it's important for the city to do its best to let people know what's coming. I do want to ask a question about speculation, because we've seen this in Williamsville. City councilors were told they were constrained because there'd been speculation on lots based on what was going on, even though it wasn't really in the zoning bylaw, and therefore they couldn't really say no anymore. And these proposals clearly identify areas of growth where land values will have shot up. And how does the city deal with that? Is this report now paving the way for the possibility of developers saying, hey, you know, we saw it in the report and we want the 6 stories or the 12 stories. And does that limit the ability of the public to weigh in and say, really, we don't want that here, that's too much? I know in the presentation, there was talk about green lighting, and the presentation from Sydney District just talked about green lighting. I'd like to understand more about what green lighting means. I heard in the presentation that the setbacks on Brock and Johnson seem to be right at the sidewalk, and I think that's a mistake. There has to be a setback. There was a lot of talk about side yard setback and backyard setback, but what about on the street? We need those wide sidewalks and then some space for greenery, a tree, whatever. I'd like that clarified, what the setback is, especially in that area. On Portsmouth Avenue, I don't understand why the intensification doesn't go right from, I guess it's King to Johnson. There's a gap there, and I know someone was planning to build a 4-story house there in the or apartment dwelling in the past, so I don't really know why there is that gap. Sort of what I would say north of public health. So I would like that to be explained. Just doesn't make sense to have that gap where that intensification isn't allowed. I'd like to understand more about how secondary suites work when there is this constraint on building in backyards, and that slide that showed 17%, or the lot coverage slide, sorry. Taught. I'm not thinking that clearly, but there was something there. I went, well, what about the secondary suite policy? How does that fit in? So I think those are all of my questions. I did worry that the capacity studies in this report seem kind of slim, and I confess I haven't read them entirely, and I know there was some talk about the traffic study just now, but traffic and water and sewer are really important. Can the city really sustain developments of the intensity that this proposes with our current infrastructure, or does it require more city spending to enable this all to take place? And I just want to say a little bit about shadow studies. You know, if you say in December there's shadow, well, December isn't just that one moment in December, it's November to January, March, January, February. So what are we really saying about how much darkness people will live in? And the sun is really important, especially in those months. So I just didn't want to see those shadow studies dismissed as showing that there's adequate light most of the day. I think that might not be the case. And I think that is all. I'm very glad this is only being received and not approved, because I think approval would have been really upsetting to people. So thank you for correcting that error. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And who's next?
Mr. Chair, Mike Keane is next.
Oh, my
Okay. Mr. Keane.
Good evening, committee. My name is Mike Keane, and I'm a land use planner with Foten Consultants, located at 4 Cataraqui Street. And I'm here tonight on behalf of Student Village Housing. They're the only client I've actually had the chance to reach out to since the report was released for review on Friday. And I'm probably coming at it from a slightly different perspective than some of the other people that have spoke this evening, because in the report that was released a year ago, Student Village Housing's holdings, for the most part, were located in one of these intensification areas. So we were actually quite happy with the recommendations of the report. And with this latest revision, all of that land has actually been removed from being an intensification area. It's an area along Brock and University. So what you'll see when you look at the report in detail is that area, including the university expansion area, is all removed from being one of these intensification areas. So it is something that we've asked staff to reconsider. I'm relieved, as the other speakers are, that this has been changed from an approval to a received report. it will give chance to reach out to other colleagues and other professionals in the industry to make sure that we take a look at this report and review it. So my only question that will likely fall to staff relates to this change from an approval to being received, which is the fact that one of the slides said that there would be an official plan amendment coming forward this fall for I guess at least a public meeting, a new section 10G related to intensification. And if I understand correctly, that would come ahead of this report being finalized. So I'm struggling a little bit with the process of, if the report really is final and we're, saying it's not, it's now just being received, but there's amendments coming forward ahead of the report now being received. I would just like a bit of clarification on that process, and I'll do my best to ensure the community knows and try to provide more comments leading up to that November 5th deadline. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll receive one more delegation and then we'll go to answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, just 1 second here. Sorry. Next was Mr. Geventer.
Thank you.
Matt. Go ahead, Matthew.
Thanks. Thanks for allowing me to present or to ask some questions at this point. Excuse me. I want to first start and say that my sense, I'm speaking as an individual now, although I've been active in the Kingsport Community Association. We haven't been active in the past few months, obviously, but I'm still speaking as an individual. My observation was that the consultant was very responsive, that the process was very open. We had a lot of input, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate your considering this. I'm going to talk about a personal matter, but not as a personal point for a moment, but because I'll generalize, okay? I received in the mail to my mailbox today in Kingsport. By the way, I live 93 Hillcrest Avenue. I received a letter, handwritten letter from someone claiming to be living in Toronto and willing to pay cash on the spot for housing. If I know anybody who's willing to sell, or if I'm willing to sell, and they have development opportunities now outside the Kingsport area, from coming in from outside Kingsport. We have about 8 or 9 buildings in Kingsport that are painted industrial gray. And we know of people who've been moved out of those homes. They were apartments or divided houses, or in some cases. And the rents being asked are something in the area of $2,000 for a small apartment. So much for, in our presentation to the consultant, to you, we made a point that Kingsport was facing immense pressures. By the time you act on these recommendations, if you don't act quickly, you're going to be faced with a totally changed situation, and not for the better. Affordable housing will be decimated in Kingsport. Affordable people able to buy housing. The recommendation is for the Kingsport area is to have it designated as a heritage area, and to require, with the expectation that excuse me, I'm fumbling here, with the expectation that that new developments, that developments should conform with the character of the area. When developers come in and paint whole swaths, slices of the area industrial gray, and dump families, and end up with broken apartments, which they may have a right to do or not. The area, the historical character of the area is being decimated. So I understand that the major changes that this might affect. It seems to me, I I apologize. I haven't looked at the zoning bylaw. I've just begun a study of it, especially prompted by this report that I better look at and see what's going on. But my impression is that the requirement for buildings to maintain the character of the area is not going to be enacted until an official plan review 4 years, 5 years from now. It's before that, but by the time it results in any impact. So that's too late for Kingsport. The only other comment I want to make, and I don't want to detract from all the other comments being made, which are very important. I talking about Kingsport. The other one comment I make was there's a slide, there's an image in the report about housing and how beneficial it is to have row housing with small setbacks and allows people to interface with each other. That is true in more, and the picture taken was from Sydneym. So the more central the space is to this core of the city, the more that works. But for an area like Kingsport, like Strathcona, it doesn't quite work that way. People sitting on their porches create human contact, human continuity. They don't have to, it's a different style, different area. So to generalize that statement to the whole central Kingston study is what is risky in my mind in terms of the characters of the areas. So I'd like to hear comments on that. There's a lot of very sophisticated content in the report, and I don't say I fully understand all the chart, all the images of how big things can be built and what the various choices were. I read them. I did try and integrate them. I wouldn't claim to have fully understood them. But thank you for the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Elizabeth, we'll go to the our planners to respond to some of those comments and questions. And if you can organize the next 4, we'll go on to the second group then. So who would like to tackle some of those questions? Ms. Agarwal, the floor is yours. Oh, if you can unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I can start with some of the responses, and then if Mr. Salagi or Ms. Aggie or Mr. Park would like to add on. I wanted to first of all thanks everyone for their feedback. We have made a note of the comments provided by the SDA and happy to follow up on those directly. There was a comment made about the 10.7 meters roofs or the 10.7 meters height. I just wanted to point out that we did look at the height for low density residential developments in the context of flat roofs and also in the context of peak roofs. And those recommendations have been directly incorporated in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So for flat roofs, we are actually recommending a height of 9 meters or 3 stories, whichever is the lesser. And then for peaked roofs, it's a height of 10.7 meters or 3 stories, whichever is the lesser. So just wanted to clarify that. There was a comment about urban design guidelines. So our recommendation or our plan for the guidelines at this point is that we do want to review them in greater detail as part of the next official plan update and see if we can actually incorporate some of those guidelines as OP policies to give them greater weight. I understand there are some additional comments that will be provided later at this meeting with respect to the Sydneym Heritage District. There were some comments made about speculation on lots, and does that limit members of the public providing more comments or changes being made? So like I said previously, we are here to receive feedback on these recommendations. So nothing is being finalized yet. We are open to refining these recommendations based on the feedback received. So just wanted to clarify that. There was a comment made about what green lighting means. So in this context, green lighting means upzoning these sites, and also through this process, also identifying the zoning framework for these sites. So that when applications come in, they don't have to go through a zoning bylaw.
I believe Ms. Agarwal is frozen. Would Paige or Mike like to step in?
Yes, hopefully Sukriti will bounce back shortly, but at least continue the green lighting conversation. The intent there is not only to establish the framework, but to try to create a framework with as few complications as possible, so that the type of development that, if we agree at the end, as I said, no decisions have been made, but if we assume that this decision is the direction we want to take, to allow that to occur with the least amount of zoning amendments or official plan amendments, things like that, that add to the cost of the building, which then developers often take back and say, well, we need to get more yield from these buildings, and then they seek out greater zoning amendments. So the green lighting is just to establish a framework that permits the type of development that we want to see.
Thank you. And
Ms. Agarwal is back.
Yes, my apologies. I don't really know what happened. Everything just froze for me. So yeah, so I understand Mr. Tsilagi just responded to that question about what green lighting meant. The next question was around setbacks along Johnson and Brock streets. So as part of this work, a 2-meter setback along Brock and Johnson streets are being proposed, and a 3-meter side yard setback, exterior side yard setback along the side streets is proposed. So this is outside of the public right of way. So the sidewalks are typically located within the municipal right of way, and so the 2-meter setback would actually provide that some additional space in addition to the public amenities that are typically provided within a municipal road allowance. There was a question around why there was a gap in the proposed intensification area along Portsmouth. So those lots, I think it's south of, I'm blanking the name of the street, just north of King Street. So that block was left out because the lot depths are shallower in that block as compared to the rest of the Portsmouth corridor portion. And in order to be able to allow a certain form of development, we need a certain lot depth. And we found that those lots, it'll be difficult to accommodate 4-story type developments that would be could be designed efficiently. There was a comment around how second units would work, I believe, with respect to the building depth regulations. So the building depth regulations that we are proposing would only apply to the principal building or the main dwelling. If somebody was to propose a second residential unit located within that main building, so for example, in a basement or in a rear addition, they would still need to meet that 18-meter building depth. And any accessory, any second residential units that are located in a detached accessory building, those are subject to their own regulations. So they are limited by lot coverage and also by height. So the building depth will only apply to the main building, whether or not it contains a second unit within the main building. There was a comment made around the traffic studies and the servicing component of this work. So as part of this as part of the zoning bylaw amendment, we will be proposing a holding symbol to be added to the intensification zones because we do acknowledge that there is still some more work that's left to be done, specifically as it relates to transportation impact studies as future developments come in, and also ensuring that servicing would be available. There was a question around the reduction in the proposed intensification area around Johnson and Brock. So we had proposed the entirety of what we call the campus expansion area as a future intensification area in a previous report that was released in 2020, which was called the Strategic Directions Report. However, as we looked at those recommendations and also looked at servicing capacity in that area, we reduced the proposed area of intensification primarily along lots that front on Johnson Street and Brock Street. We do propose to, or we do intend to look at that area as a whole as part of a future density by design exercise, or as a separate piece of work, as we feel that we do need to pay more attention to the servicing capacity of that area, and also potentially look at financial viability analysis. There was a comment around how does this work line up with the proposed future official plan amendment to add a new section 10G. So primarily, staff will be taking forward any implementing official plan amendment and zoning recommendations coming out of this work outside of the work that the consultant has done. So that official plan amendment will be undertaken sometime this fall. So there will be a separate statutory public meeting as part of the Planning Act process, which will be followed by a comprehensive report, likely earlier next year. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that process. So the recommendations of these reports have been made by the consultant, but staff will be refining those recommendations as we move forward with this work. And the recommendations, like I said, will be refined based on the feedback that we receive from now until November 5th. The zoning recommendations have been included in the new zoning bylaw along with the mapping. So again, we are receiving feedback on those zoning recommendations as well as part of the new zoning bylaw project. Specifically to Kingsport, there were some comments made around designating Kingsport as a heritage area. I can't really speak to that piece as the heritage designations are undertaken by our Heritage Services Department. But I do want to say that as part of this work, we have brought Kingsport in its own zone to better reflect what's existing in that area. So for example, to better reflect the front yard setbacks in that area, and also the existing side yard setbacks, and introduced a building depth provision to control over development of properties. So I'm hoping that that would address some of these concerns. And I just wanted to reiterate, if staff are always available for further conversations, I understand that this is complex work and it can be a challenge sometimes to understand what's being presented, but staff are always happy to meet with members of the public at a later time to go over the recommendations. Thanks.
Are there some more hands up, Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Next to speak will be John Grenville.
The floor is yours, John. Do you want to unmute yourself? You've never been muted before. So. If you want to unmute yourself, that'd be good.
Got it. Got it. Thanks very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
My name is John Grenville. I live at 24 Jenkins Street in Williamsville District. I have to say I'm confused, or was confused, and still maybe a little confused over the purpose of the meeting. I looked at the material on the website this afternoon, and the agenda clearly talked about approval, which was problematic. There was no agenda, amended agenda when I looked. I now understand what's being done, but I don't think that this precludes the need for better consultation prior to this meeting in neighborhoods that are being affected. Having said that, I'll read my notes as I prepared them, because I think there are still some points. I think the points that I'm making are still relevant. I've been a member of the working group for the development of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy since it was formed almost 4 years ago. I have participated in as many meetings and provided input to the extent possible over this extended time frame. And my intention in this 5 minutes is not to provide any detailed comment on the 300-page report that you've got in front of you tonight. I would, however, like to make a plea for others in the community, in particular those in Williamsville District, to see a 300-page report for the first time with some very significant changes to the zoning bylaw and impact on our neighborhoods, with less than a week to review, discuss, prepare feedback, and condense it into 5 minutes for presentation to the planning committee is very disconcerting, to say the least. Even as a member of the working group, this is the first time that I have seen things like the urban design guidelines that were prepared by Brooke McElroy. Residents need to be considered, and the planning department needs to provide neighborhood forums for discussion on the recommendations in order for meaningful consultation to take place before a report is labeled as a final report. I said I wasn't going to get into the detailed input. However, I couldn't help but comment on one of the objectives of the study, that was to deal with current zoning regulations that prevent development that is out of scale within existing neighborhoods. This came to a head about 5 years ago with the construction of a dormitory on Center Street that was completely out of scale and character. The changes proposed in this report may solve the problem. I don't know. I did not see any real life examples where I could see how the changes in the zoning bylaw would have solved the out of scale development. Although the issue came to a head with Center Street, it continues to fester, especially in the near campus neighborhoods. Showing residents how a change to the zoning bylaw solves neighborhood problems takes staff time. I recognize that, but it adds credibility to the planning process. It may have been done within this report, but I haven't seen it yet, and I'm still reading. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide input tonight.
Thank you, John. And who's next?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is David Gordon.
Hello, Mr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon, the floor is yours.
Bonjour. Can you hear me, folks? And are my slides up?
No, but Elizabeth.
Could I have the first slide, please?
Here you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm David Gordon. I live at 67 Sydneym Street. I've lived in Sydneym District for over 30 years, first as a student on Brock Street near the intensification area, later as a homeowner on Earl Street, and now in the Annandale condo. My day job is as a professor of urban planning at Queen's and former director of our planning school. Council has been kind enough to appoint me to the Central Kingston Growth Study Advisory Committee, where we served for 4 long years and many, many, many meetings, public events. Central Kingston has a serious problem with conversion of single-family homes. Thousands have been changed in the last decade. This problem is encouraged by outmoded zoning bylaw from 1941. Next slide, please. Get my own next slide up.
Come on, where's the speech? Central Kingston's first zoning bylaw was passed in 1941. It's still the core of the area's zoning bylaw today. It was prepared long before Kingston had professional planners by a well-meaning group of citizen volunteers. It was based on an outmoded American zoning bylaw from the 1930s. Next slide, please. The A zone is still in place today. It's later amended to allow a floor space index 1.0, which allows as much floor area as the lot size. This is a serious error. I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction in Canada that has a floor space index of 1 in its low density designation. Vancouver is currently considering increasing its floor area ratio from 0.5 to 0.6 to permit more infill. Kingston has twice as much. It's the reason we have twice the problems. Central Kingston has deep lots, so huge house additions are permitted. The second big problem is that Sydneym Ward was zoned in 1941 to allow for apartment buildings to replace all the older homes and for urban renewal. The area was considered a slum to be eradicated in the 40s and 50s. Today, it's one of Ontario's most important heritage conservation district, but you can still build apartment buildings tomorrow in it. It's a mistake, a bad one. This report has many, many positive changes. I support the intensification zones as shown. I especially support the 6 floors on Brock and Johnson. They're a good scale. There's big, deep lots there. And the timber construction's magnificent. We've got to learn to do this better in Kingston. It's both more affordable than concrete and more sustainable. Dropping the floor space index is mandatory. It's a terrible policy. I support the change on Collingwood Street from E to R1 and the Jenkins Street change, and the idea of green lighting what you want with an H rather than making everybody go through a rezoning. If you're going to have a rezoning, people generally say, okay, let's go for 20 stories. Next slide, please. The study proposes to control monster additions by setting a maximum limit of 18 meters or 59 feet. I have no idea where that came from. It's really long. Our house on 79 Earl Street was 34 feet deep, and 36 feet is a common depth for homes in Sydneym Ward. This monster addition you see here at 230 Collingwood Street, 2 more houses behind the original, is only 20 meters. I'd suggest maybe 15 meters, not 18. But we need to see some evidence, as Grenville said that 18 is going to solve it. It's hard to find many homes with the main building more than 15 meters in the study area, unless they have one of these unfortunate additions that overshadow the neighbor's backyard and destroy its privacy. Next slide, please. For Old Sydneym Ward, the study defers to the new zoning bylaw, and I quote, the Old Sydenham's Heritage Conservation District is proposed to be brought into its own zone, HCD3, to better reflect the existing character of the area. At the moment, this doesn't appear to be correct. I lead a boring life, so I was pleased to also review the 300-page draft zoning bylaw to go with the 300 pages of this report this past weekend. We can see here that Old Sydneym Ward will permit singles, semis, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, and stacked townhouses. That's all good. Unfortunately, it also continues the 1941 mistake to allow apartment buildings as of right. Apartment buildings should not be green lighted in the Heritage Conservation District. Here's why. It's not 18-story buildings from Homestead. Its problem is replacing 2 residential lots with the low-rise apartment buildings like these built on William Street in the Heritage Conservation District, with this delightful open space and the destruction, as you can see, of the heritage townhouses. This is exactly what the old zoning anticipated and should not be permitted as of right. You want a zoning bylaw? Thank you very much for the new slide. You want an apartment building, you should do a rezoning. Next slide, please. Also, the new zoning bylaw proposal, front yard parking is prohibited in Berryfield and also in Market Square, but permitted in HCD3 Old Sydneym Ward's Heritage Conservation District. Why? This is a terrible thing. Look what happened on our former block of Earl Street, where trees and lawns were removed for parking, damaging the landscape. Every house has front yard parking, and it had a rear lane where you could park before. Finally, we don't understand where this provision that you can't build accessory buildings on Lily Lane came from. Lily Inglis and I would stand beside these buildings and giving tours to students saying, this is exactly what you want in this area. So to conclude, many positive changes, final resolution still years away, a few concerns. In the meantime, we lose scores or perhaps 100 family homes and rental housing every year. Therefore, an interim control bylaw would be appropriate until the new zoning protections are in place. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Donald Mitchell.
So, Mr. Mitchell, the floor is
Good
yours.
evening. I'm Donald Mitchell, and I'm at 43 Gibson Avenue, and I'm also representing the Sydneym District Association Board tonight. On behalf of the SDA Board and specific members that prepared these initial thoughts but were unable to attend the meeting tonight, I'd like to share and expand upon some items of concern in the Central Kingston Growth Strategy that the SDA generally believe are challenges to the stability of our area and potentially undermine the possible success of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. I'm going to eliminate a number of these because several people have brought them up tonight, and I don't feel it's appropriate to repeat it, especially when there's not a decision coming out of this. But I will touch on a few things that have been mentioned before already. The SDA do not support the 18 meters principal building depth. We note the following comments regarding floor space index from the July 21st, 2021 meeting of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy Working Group. A comment was made about the existing FSI in the A zone being very high. Eliminating FSI would be helpful. On a standard size lot of 33 feet by 132 feet, the floor space index allows a floor area of 4,356 square feet, which is excessive. A comment was made that the building depth recommendation would result in a larger floor area, so that needs to be checked. Staff will run the numbers again. We too have been trying to make sense of the numbers and feel that if the Central Kingston Growth Strategy was partially undertaken to limit as of right floor space permissions or so-called monster homes, it has not achieved this effect. Consider an example, the recent development at 42 Beverly. We've chosen because the drawings are at hand and publicly available. The building is 18.6 meters deep at its longest point, only slightly exceeding the proposed permissions, and 9.9 meters high, shorter than the proposed permissions at 10.7 meter height that would have allowed a full third story rather than a partial third story. The approximate floor area above grade is 4,900 square feet. This has been built out as a 3-unit, 13-bedroom building, which also has a basement that could easily be converted into more living space. From what we can tell by looking at Google Earth, many of the buildings in the area north of campus, between Johnson, Division, Earl, University, with their long tacked on rear additions and high bedroom counts, would not be limited by the 18-meter metric, though they would be by an 8-bedroom limit. The combination of the large as of right building area permission paired with the 8-bedroom limit seems to be an odd match. There are a few building types in an urban setting which would require 5,000 square feet to accommodate 8 bedrooms. Again, this calculation does not include basements or detached secondary residential units. Anecdotally, it seems that a 12-meter or 14-meter maximum building depth would be more appropriate. We request a demonstration by staff that the maximum building depth in the new bylaw achieves the objective of limiting development within low-density neighborhoods to a greater degree than the existing bylaw. The new proposed Sydneym Heritage Conservation Zone, which is referenced in the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, does not reflect or protect the character of the area, nor is Sydneym District in line with the other heritage areas. Points have been raised by Dr. Gordon, so I won't go into those, but I will mention one by one of our members, which was Lily Lane is an historic laneway that originally integrated additional residential units into the existing carriage houses. It seems against logic that these buildings should be expressly forbidden to be converted to ARUs again. Carriage house construction on Lily Lane should be permitted in keeping with the massing of historic structures, including a dormer story. Setbacks should be no more than 2 meters unless neighboring setbacks are less. And there should be no side yard setback. Eliminating side yard setbacks will improve residents' security. Residents on the laneway will put eyes on the lane and improve security as well. And I'd like to just finish with certainly one personal comment, and that is I would like to express my personal thank you and appreciation to city staff. I don't think any of this is easy, and I've been through this whole process from 76 Center Street, which started actually as a building official decision to put a stairwell in a location that it wasn't supposed to be. And then that inflamed into the whole size of the structure itself. But I think that CAO Hurdle, Commissioner Agnew, Sukriti Agarwal, Laura Flaherty, recently people like Mike Zalagi, and many, many other staff have really been engaged in this, involved in this, and they have really shared their time, answered our questions, dealt with emails. And I know that the engagement process may not be perfect, but I just want to commend them in front of members of council that they really have done a great job. And to the public, I do a lot of reading on all of these practices as they unfold. I just want to say that, you know, regarding the unfolding of what some might term an upper scale of middle housing in the hearts of neighborhoods, in many cases, it's unfolding as commodity housing first. I think we also need to recognize that preserving low-rise areas without allowing fair density increase is kind of like a land hoarding or a character hoarding. And there are cities that they're beginning to realize that this may actually be causing the affordability issue as well. And so I really want this to be right, and I encourage us to get it right. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, who's next?
Mr. Chair, we don't currently have any other hands at this time. Perhaps we could do a final call. And I do see another hand that has popped up. So I'm not sure if Councillor Hill did have his hand raised, if he had no, okay, excellent. But so I'm going to go to Mr. Martin. If there's anyone else who would like to speak, please raise your hand so that we are aware of that at this time. So Mr. Chair, Paul Martin is next.
Mr. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Paul Martin, 961 Linwood Drive. My first question is, how was it determined where intensification should occur? And I was wondering if Ms. Agnew could answer that question. My next question is, what are the most important factors in determining intensification? And I was wondering if Ms. Agarwal could answer that. My next question is, the infrastructure, is it in place to support where we're looking at intensifying at the moment? And if Ms. Agarwal could answer that. And then I wondered if there was a financial feasibility study done in implementing this plan from the standpoint of, will developers be able to make the numbers work given the restraints that they're looking, and I shouldn't use the word restraints, that's negative, given what the plan is at the moment? And if Ms. Agnew could answer that question. The other comment that I'd like to make is, would it be possible, Chair Neil and members of the Planning Committee, to somehow have public meetings within each of the councillors' districts to try to explain and receive feedback for what these very important strategic plans that are being proposed, so that we can try to get a little bit more feedback. You know, tonight at this meeting, and I could be wrong here, but I think there's about 30 people in attendance, and it's a far cry from the population of the city of Kingston. And these are very important changes that we're looking at putting in place. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further hands, Elizabeth?
No, Mr. Chair, there are no further hands.
Okay, we'll now go to our planning staff to address the questions asked. Ms. Agnew, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I thought that I would start, especially thank you to Mr. Martin for his comments. And there are a few that he asked me specifically to address. So I thought that I would speak to those first. So on the question of what was the determination or the determining factors that we use relative to the intensification areas. So there were a few different things in particular. One of the key pieces that we start at is that we have to look at our official plan and how it currently directs growth and higher density growth and intensification. So it gives some parameters for consideration. And, one of the key parameters is looking at locating, higher order development, higher densities of development, particularly along our arterial roads where we already have the infrastructure investment usually from a servicing perspective, but also from a transit perspective, and looking at typically that those roads have wider right-of-ways as well in terms of being able to accept the density in the taller buildings. So those are some of the key considerations that we looked at with respect to the locations that were picked. You're also looking at a consideration of context and specifically, speaking to the character of the area and what makes sense, what's around it from a land use perspective. And when you're thinking about that with respect to any type of compatibility issues such as shadowing, which we've talked about today, overlook those types of factors as well. Where we chose the Kingston Center, the site that's adjacent to the Kingston Center right at the corner of Sir John A. Macdonald and Bath. One of the other key considerations on top of the elements I spoke about in terms of walkability, transit access, width of right-of-way, the context and what's around it, is the walkability and the availability of commercial amenities to support the higher densities that are proposed for that corner. So those are the key considerations from a high-level policy and overall planning perspective, but also we are certainly strongly led by feedback that was provided through the subsequent phases that went from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. What we're looking at tonight are the phase 4 recommendations and the input that came about through the neighborhood walks, but also through the working group in particular, and giving us feedback as to the suitability of the potential intensification sites that we were looking at through this process. I think there was also a question about servicing, and that's an excellent question. So ideally, when you're looking at arterial roads and aligning growth in those areas, the pipes under those roads are typically sized differently than what you would find on a smaller local road. So again, from a growth management perspective, that's one of the key principles we look at. As part of this work, there was some servicing and infrastructure study that was done as a collaboration between WSP and our own utilities, Kingston. And we are still working through some of the details associated with that to determine if there are any small upgrades that are required to support density in certain locations. So we are going through that process right now, which is typical as part of any secondary plan where you're looking at what the phasing and the infrastructure plan is to support new growth, especially in an infill situation where you're dealing with a built up area that historically speaking wasn't anticipating maybe that level of growth, and now we're anticipating or trying to suggest more goes there. So is there a differential or an upgrade that may be required? So those are some of the detailed discussions that we're going through right now. But in general, from a locational perspective, Utilities Kingston is supportive of the areas we've chosen for intensification. With respect to the campus expansion area, Ms. Agarwal spoke to that. One of the key reasons where we looked at reducing the intensification areas from what was previously provided is going through that detailed study with WSP and Utilities Kingston. A lot of the campus expansion area is older City of Kingston, and it's also an area that hasn't been subject to full sewer separation at this point in time. And there's a lot of detailed analysis that has to be done almost on a street by street basis when you look at trying to intensify or upzone in that area, because they're combined into one pipe right now. And I know that we hear certainly at planning committee, especially in some individual applications where folks have come forward to say, when I have high rain events, our street is flooded out, we still have combined sewers, I'm concerned about the overland flow and what's going into maybe our parkland or our waterfront. So that area in particular, before we went and looked at developing a framework of any possible intensification right close within the campus expansion area adjacent to Queen's University, there's a lot of work that has to be done on sewer separation. We do have, I think it's a 20 or 25-year plan that Utilities Kingston has developed for that area, but looking at the logical sequencing of what's getting funded and when, and therefore when we align that with policy, we still have quite a bit of additional study to do on that piece, which is why in this report, we've talked about that being subject to some future study and why you saw a reduction, particularly at Brock and Johnson, in terms of the overall areas of intensification that we're suggesting at this time. On the market study piece as well, what we did do is we took the learning from Williamsville with respect to looking at the models that we built, particularly around mid-rise construction, because that's primarily the form that we're looking at here. We also did look at higher densities as part of that work for Williamsville, where we upzoned to 20 stories in certain locations. So what we intend to do after we get through a few more months of public consultation and we have a greater sense of exactly where we're arriving at, we're going to put those scenarios once again through the economic model so that we are just checking those pieces. But generally speaking, we've really tried to take the learning with respect to lesser parking ratios overall, so not forcing people to build more parking than they need. We gave consideration in terms of how we built the zoning framework to not be overly prescriptive and really requiring a lot of very tiered buildings that take away from building efficiency, looking at wood frame construction. So all of those factors that we learned from Williamsville really positively led to outcomes for us to have confidence in that mid-rise zoning framework that we've put into place, that we borrowed that continued thinking through this area, but we'll continue to look at doing a little bit of revised market analysis once we're at a point where we're really secure with what we're going to be recommending as the final pieces for council adoption. So that is work that is still coming, but we've done preliminary work looking at the recommendations and taking those lessons and applying the same type of thinking to the zoning framework that's been presented as draft tonight through this consideration of the phase 4 work. I think those are the questions that were directed to me specifically, so I'll defer to my colleagues. It looks like Sukriti is ready to step in and continue. Thank you.
Ms. Agarwal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Ms. Agnew for those responses. So I'll try and cover the rest of the comments that were made in this second section. We heard a lot about the 18-meter building depth being too much, and how does it relate to a standard size lot, which is 33 feet by 132 feet. So staff did run the calculations on what that 18-meter building depth would result in terms of the floor area of a building permitted within those zones. So our calculation indicates that it would be approximately 3,800 square feet of floor area that would be permitted on a standard size lot, as compared to the approximately 4,300 without that. So with an FSI of 1, the floor area that could be permitted on those lots would be about 4,300. And I just wanted to reiterate that, like, we ran this calculation for a standard size lot. However, there are several lots within the central Kingston area that are much, much greater in area than a typical 10-meter by a 30-meter lot. So, and specifically within the A zone. So for example, if the lot area was 6,000 square feet, and with our current regulations in place with a floor space index of 1, 6,000 square feet of floor area would be permitted, provided that all of the other setbacks can be maintained. However, with a building depth approach, regardless of the size of the lot, 3,800 square feet of floor area would be permitted on 3 floors. There were some questions around Lily Lane and why we were limiting accessory buildings with residential units along that lane. So as part of this work, there was some discussions held specifically around the Old Sydneym Heritage Conservation District, and it was brought to our attention that there is a sewer apparently that goes under Lily Lane, and until it's likely a combined sewer. So until that sewer separation takes place, and since it's a very tight lane, so the recommendation was that until that time, accessory buildings would be appropriate, but not accessory buildings which have residential units in them. So for example, a second residential unit. There were some questions around the zoning for the Heritage Conservation District not reflecting the character of the area, with apartment buildings being continued to be permitted. So the new zoning bylaw basically defines an apartment building. Oh, let me just open the link. Yeah, so it means a building that is used for the purpose of 4 or more dwelling units. And then it goes on. So basically, it doesn't necessarily mean like what we think of a typical apartment building to be. So any building that has 4 units would be considered an apartment building under the new zoning bylaw. So what we were trying to do is still kind of allowing the number of units that the current B zone allows, which is a maximum of 6. However, revising the built form so that it more closely matches what is currently in the A zone. So which we are calling the UR5 zone in the new zoning bylaw. So in comparison, the Sydneym HCD zoning and the A zone zoning are very similar in terms of the build form. However, we were allowing up to a maximum of 6 units on each lot. There was also a comment made about front yard parking permitted in the HCD. We can certainly look at that to make sure that it aligns with the Old Sydneym Heritage Conservation District plan. So we'll take that comment back. And I think that was mostly it. There were several comments made about further consultation with neighborhood associations, and we'll definitely follow up on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more hands up? Elizabeth?
No, Mr. Chair, we don't see any other hands.
Okay, and I believe we answered the questions asked. We'll go back into committee, and then we will have an opportunity to put the motion on the floor to receive the report. Who among the committee would like to speak? Yes, Councillor Tyler.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, one technical question, Ms. Agarwal. You were talking about up to 3,800 square feet based on the 18-meter lot setback. Is that the maximum for all lot sizes? I know that you're giving an illustration of a bigger lot and that would still be the maximum. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, and through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct. So that example that I was giving was specifically for the area that is within the current A zone. So applying the side yard setbacks, the front yard setback. So yes, so regardless of any lot size within that A zone area, 3,800 would be the maximum.
Per floor, is that correct?
No, that's the total on 3 floors.
Oh, total, okay, yeah, I'm glad I asked. Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, Councillor Sen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I did hear Mr. Grenville's question about looking at all the changes being proposed in the report. Which developments, would, if we had already implemented all of this over the past couple of years, like which developments would this have, been able to either stop or helped us do differently? And I just wonder, I don't know if staff have any examples off the top of their head, but I think I would like to see that being addressed as we go forward into November. Because we did this report for a reason, and they were pretty specific developments, and where we're, I don't know, I just wondered if staff have any comments about that.
If I can just speak into, I don't have specific examples at the ready. However, that was a comment that Mr. Grenville had sent over to us previously. So we're very aware of that, and it is something that we want to take into account as well. And as Ms. Agrawal and Ms. Agnew had mentioned earlier, this is really, in many ways, although this has taken a long time to get to this point, this is really very much the beginning of this more serious process of actually looking at adopting some of these policies and zoning regulations. So we will continue to work on this as we go along, including applying these to real life examples and seeing how some of these more problematic examples would be affected by that, and if adjustments need to be made or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to the 3,800 square feet that's allowed. And I heard the answer to Councillor Kivey's question, and I realized that it's 3,800 square feet over 3 floors. I caught that. So I'm wondering why 3,800 square feet was chosen. I mean, the whole point of this is to eliminate monster houses and conversions above a certain number of bedrooms, and clearly sizes are related to that. So why did we pick 3,800 square feet? And
Who
how?
would like to,
I
who
got
would like to
follow-up
answer
questions.
that?
I'll just speak to this again, that the 18 meters was recommended to us through our consultants on this project through an analysis they had done through industry standards and examples taken from other cities. So if this is something that we need to further refine, it's certainly something we can do, but that's where we were able to take that 18 meter depth from. And then when applying it in some of these, for example, on the 10 meter lot, it did seem to achieve some of the goals that we had set out.
And Ms. Agnew wanted to address that as well.
Okay.
Thank you. In addition to that, to what Mr. Szilagyi offered, certainly, WSP did some best practice research in terms of looking at zoning parameters from other cities, but they also did analysis of the built form that's existing in the area and the lot fabric. So there was a combination of the two pieces that led to the recommendation around the 18 meters. Clearly, we've heard tonight from a number of individuals feeling that that is too generous. So we're happy to take that away and go and look at it and come back and circle back on this with the community and certainly the committee.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would encourage that. I've got a couple of follow-up questions that are involved with that. What's the average house size in the area of the Sydneym district? It was just indicated that consultants look at built form. So.
I see Ms. Agnew has her hand.
Thank you, and through you, Ms. Agrawal may know, I certainly don't know that right off the top of my head in terms of like the actual floor plate of the average size unit that's in the Sydneym district ward. Sukriti, is that something that you would know? Otherwise, Councillor Hutchison, I think we'd have to circle back with you on that one in particular.
Yes, Ms. Agrawal.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Hutchison, yeah, we can get back to you on that. We do have a huge spreadsheet with a lot of numbers, so we can definitely look into what the average size is.
Okay, so in addition, I mean, when I'm looking at this, I think the fundamental question is, how do we prevent monster homes in these large additions and builds. Like at 3,800 square feet, meaning maybe we're talking about, let me clear this. Are we talking about houses or are we talking about apartment buildings? Or both?
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is for the low density type uses. So for single detached, semi-detached and row houses, that 18-meter depth would apply. So we are not talking about apartment buildings here, except for the Sydneym 8CD, where we are also proposing this 18-meter depth, where like apartments as defined in the new zoning bylaw, which basically mean any building containing four units or more. So that would apply only within that area, but not within the rest of the areas.
Okay, because there's nothing small about 3,800 square feet. I think the average house is probably like, even in the suburban areas, is like 2,300. And in the downtown area, it's probably most of them are considerably small. So we're not talking about somebody building a house or a family.
Thank you. If we can keep this portion to questions, once we have the recommendation on the floor, we can make comments at that time. Thank you. Any more questions, Councillor Hutchison?
No, I'm fine for the moment. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions? If you could take the chair.
And even I recognize you.
Thank you. I just have two very quick questions. Both the representatives of Sydneym District Association mentioned Lower Beverly and a concern about an overbuild on some approved ones. I believe, and if you can look into this if you don't have an immediate answer, but I believe when we approved those, we heard those concerns and we placed a specific number of bedrooms on those approvals. If that's not the, I believe that's the case. So I guess I see Mr. Park has his hand up. Could we address that through our zoning property standards?
Through you, Mr. Chair, just to speak to the two zoning amendments that were subject to previous review and approval by Planning Committee and Council. In those two, 42 and 49 Beverly, there were no, at that point in time, bedroom count limitations put into the zoning bylaw. What was limited was the unit count. They were both limited to 3 units. And what we found subsequently was after they were approved, they started adding more bedroom units than were originally shown in the plans before Planning Committee. However, there was nothing within the zoning bylaw at that point in time, the site-specific one, or the primary zoning bylaw that contained the bedroom count. Shortly after.
That's clearly our mistake then, because
you're absolutely correct.
I know in Williamsville we've done that.
Yeah. Following that, we started implementing on a site-specific basis bedroom counts, which then we followed up with amendment to the zoning bylaw to limit bedroom counts in the primary and secondary residential units to bedrooms. And so that is, which has been appealed, but as we do look at applications still, we are imposing bedroom counts on developments.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And what's just come up on our screen, and I want to thank you to our clerk, the average meters, square meters of each gross floor area by district is there.
Councillor Neal, I see Miss Agnew has her hand up and Miss Agarwal as well. So
Yes.
we're just.
Yes, thank you. And Ms. Agarwal may have some additional comments. We just wanted to clarify and share that, for the committee's benefit and for the public, that came from one of the earlier phases of this report, which is more like information collection and looking at existing conditions. So those are the average dwelling sizes within each of the districts that we had a look at for single detached dwellings specifically. So that'll give you a sense. I know they're in square meters as opposed to square feet, but basically multiply by a factor of just over 10, and that'll give you your square feet approximately.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Councillor Neal, like the chair back.
Thank you. I will indeed. And now we're looking for a mover and a seconder for the proposed proposal. Yes, Councillor Kiley moves. Is there a seconder? Councillor Hill, thank you very much. We now have it on the floor. Now would be a good time if you have any further comments. Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Okay, I forgot to ask a question. So there was talk here about the comments from the public, and it's come up repeatedly before, and that is limiting the as of right for apartment buildings in the Sydneym district in particular, but in general. So how does this document address that?
Who would like to address that? Ms. Agnew and Ms. Agarwal. Who would like to go first?
Maybe I'll start and then Sukriti can add some comments. So definitely, and again, this is linked to the new zone that's being proposed for the Sydneym Heritage Conservation District, and in linking it with the new zoning bylaw, the definition that we have in there of apartment dwelling is, a building containing 4 or more units. So obviously apartments can vary in size, but when we look at how each of the different types of dwelling, whether it's single detached, semi-detached, row, town, how they're defined, there certainly are some existing like smaller 4 or more units that would be considered an apartment dwelling. The concern is, I think, with respect to them becoming much larger. So certainly the comment, has been heard, and this is something that we'll have to circle back on with Laura Flaherty as well too, since it's linked to the new zoning bylaw and how we're defining that use period for the city, and look at the appropriateness of that given the comments we've received tonight. Sukriti, I don't know if you have any additional information that you'd like to offer on that.
Thank you, Ms. Agnew. No, I don't have anything additional. So yes, as Ms. Agnew said, we'll take that comment back and review it also in the context of the old heritage, the old Sydneym Heritage Conservation District Plan.
Thank you. Any follow-up comments?
No, that would be good. And just to be absolutely clear, the document in front of us does not eliminate as of right apartments in the Sydneym district. That's what I got that was going to be circled back on. That's what I got out of what was said. Am I correct?
That's correct. It's in there as a suggested permitted use in the new zone that's been created specifically for the conservation district, in recognition of buildings that have 4 or more units, for which there are many of them in the Sydneym district. So part of the challenge that we also have is not creating a bunch of legal non-complying or non-conforming uses as part of the new creation of the zoning, of how do we recognize what's there and not create a whole bunch of non-compliance for those existing properties, while looking at how we want to provide opportunity for future growth as well. So we'll have to circle back on that, Councillor. It is indicated in the zoning table as a permitted use as of right, but certainly we have heard the comments tonight, and we're happy to circle back on that as a team and have a second look at it.
Thank you. I do think it's crucial. I understand your issue about non-conforming, but the point is that the bylaws have been allowing it with the negative effects for 70 years. So you got to change it someday, hopefully, before the district is hollowed out. And I suppose that might apply in a different way to Kingsport. So thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none, could you take the chair?
I do, and I recommend.
My only comment, both Dr. Gordon and both the Sydneym District Association people raised a concern which I share, which is without an interim control bylaw, what will preclude a rush to getting approvals that are going to be contrary to the principles of the new interim control bylaw and this directive that we're suggesting tonight. I know planners always cringe a little when they hear the words interim control bylaw, but I think it proved very effective in the Williamsville corridor. And I would hate to see the really positive principles of this document and of the interim control bylaw lost because there's a rush to more permissive, as Councillor Hutchison has pointed out, 60-year-old bylaws, zoning bylaws. Would somebody like to, I think that's above a lot of pay grades, but maybe Paige could address that comment.
I'll certainly do my best. Thank you, Councillor Neal. So yes, interim control bylaw, it is a tool that's available under the Planning Act. It's a very strong tool in that it halts development. So I think, true to the comments that came up tonight, the central growth strategy came out of a conversation about an interim control bylaw based on concern about incompatible development applications coming through in certain neighborhoods. So to circle back to where we are now, I can understand where the concern will be. And that's always been the concern of how much degree of change can happen before a sense of a neighborhood is lost or people feel like they no longer can live where they want to because the characters changed or because things have developed in such a way that it infringes upon their privacy, all of those types of things that we look at it from a compatibility perspective. The challenge is where we are in the process. One of the requirements associated with the passing of an interim control bylaw is the completion of a study. So the question that I don't have that I'm happy to circle back with our legal team on is that typically if a council enacts an interim control bylaw, which you can do at any point, you don't have to give notice, you bring a bylaw to council, you make a decision, it's in effect that night, but you have to scope it. And because the study area of Central Kingston is so expansive, looking at like really getting a sense of what you want to control so that there aren't unintended consequences of it being scoped too wide and then we're not allowing anything. So it's really a matter of there has to be, I would think, a much more detailed understanding of what exactly the concern is, because you're regulating, you're not permitting a use. You don't actually put a hold on development per se. You have to be able to define it and you have to be able to define the geography. So because this spans its Sydneym district, it's also going into Portsmouth, you're into Sunnyside, you're into Williamsville, potentially parts of it. You're going into Kingsport. It goes almost all the way up to Rideau Heights in terms of the area that's covered by this study. So I think we would have to know more about exactly what council wanted to do. And certainly as staff, we're here to help like provide you with that information and to help you make an informed decision if that's something that you want to do. It just has to be done really carefully.
I appreciate that. And I'm not saying this because I think you and your department are underworked, which is definitely not the case. But if this, both the official plan and the interim control bylaw I'm sorry, the comprehensive bylaw is going to be 2 years up the road or longer, it's unfortunate if we pass these measures and we've already lost the war, if you will, and development has taken place that undermines the intent of those things. So let's talk about this offline. So thank you. But I have a feeling I would probably support a motion, possibly by the Sydney representative, to consider an interim control bylaw. Enough said.
You can have the chair back.
Thank you very much. Any further questions on this? We have the motion before us as amended in the addendum. So the motion is to receive the report. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. And thank you and your staff, Ms. Agnew, for all the hard work that went into this. That puts us at the end of our agenda. We have no motions. Any notices of motion? Seeing none. Other business? Seeing none. Correspondence we've received in the addendum, and I have a feeling we will continue to receive. And the date of our next meeting is Thursday, September 2nd. So I will now look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Hutchison, seconder. Councillor Osanek. All those in favor? Thank you very much.